World War II was a war of machines, men, and minds. By 1944, the air war over Europe and the Pacific had become a deadly chess match, with each side searching for any edge technological, tactical, or psychological. For one American fighter squadron, the answer to a deadly problem came not from a new weapon or a secret gadget, but from a can of paint and a willingness to break the rules. The squadron's story begins in the spring of 1944, at a muddy airfield somewhere in England. The pilots of the 357th Fighter Group flying P-51 Mustangs were exhausted. They'd been flying escort missions for months, protecting bombers on their way to targets deep inside Germany. The Luftwaffe was still dangerous, and every mission meant running a gauntlet of flak, enemy fighters, and the ever-present risk of mechanical failure. But the real problem wasn't just the enemy, it was the enemy's tactics. German pilots had learned to look for weakness in the American formations. They watched for stragglers, damaged planes, and any sign that a fighter was limping home. These wounded birds became easy prey, picked off by experienced aces who knew how to finish the job. The losses mounted, and morale began to suffer. Captain Jack Fox-Morgan, the squadron's operations officer, was the first to notice the pattern. He saw that the Germans were targeting planes that looked damaged planes with oil streaks, bullet holes, or missing panels. He also noticed that some of the most aggressive enemy pilots would break formation to chase what they thought was an easy kill, leaving themselves exposed to counterattack. One night, over a cup of bad coffee in the squadron tent, Morgan shared his idea with his wingman, Lieutenant Sam Painter Harris. "What if we gave them what they wanted?" Morgan asked. "What if we made our planes look like they were about to fall out of the sky just to see what the Germans would do?" Harris, who had a knack for art and a mischievous streak, grinned. "You mean paint fake damage on the planes? Bullet holes, oil leaks, maybe a little smoke?" Morgan nodded. "Exactly. If we can make them think we're wounded, maybe we can lure them in and then turn the tables." The idea was risky, maybe even reckless, but the squadron was desperate for an edge. The next morning, Harris raided the supply tent for paint, brushes, and anything else he could find. He spent hours studying real battle damage photographs, wrecked planes, and the scars on his own Mustang. Then, with a steady hand and a creative eye, he began to paint. The first damaged plane was a masterpiece of deception. Harris added jagged black lines to simulate bullet holes, streaks of brown and gray to mimic oil leaks, and even a few patches of burnt paint near the engine cowling. From a distance, the plane looked like it had barely survived its last mission. Up close, the illusion was even more convincing. Morgan and Harris took the plane up for a test flight, circling the airfield, and then landing in full view of the ground crews. The reaction was immediate. Mechanics rushed over, convinced the plane had been hit. Pilots gathered around, laughing and shaking their heads when they realized the damage was fake. The squadron commander, Colonel Red Davis, was less amused. "You'd have too much time on your hands," he grumbled. "But if it works, I want to hear about it." The next day, Morgan and Harris took their wounded Mustang out on a real mission. They flew at the edge of the formation, making sure to look vulnerable slower turns, a little wobble, and just enough radio chatter to suggest engine trouble. Sure enough, a pair of FW-190 spotted them and broke formation to attack. As the Germans closed in, Morgan and Harris snapped into action, turning hard and opening fire. The element of surprise was total. One FW-190 went down in flames, the other barely escaped. Word spread quickly. The squadron's fake damage tactic was a hit literally. Over the next week, more pilots joined in, painting their planes with simulated bullet holes, oil streaks, and scorch marks. The Germans, convinced they were attacking easy prey, fell for the ruse again and again. In 1 month, the squadron ambushed and shot down 40 enemy fighters, more than any other unit in the theater. The tactic wasn't just about paint, it was about psychology. The Marines had long used deception on the ground: dummy tanks, fake radio traffic, and feigned retreats. Now, the air war had its own version. By appearing weak, the squadron exploited the enemy's overconfidence, luring them into traps and turning perceived vulnerability into a deadly advantage. But the success of the fake damage tactic also raised questions. Was it ethical to deceive the enemy in this way? Was it safe for the pilots, who risked being mistaken for real stragglers by their own side? And what would happen if the Germans caught on? How the squadron perfected their ruse, the challenges they faced, and the reactions from both friend and foe. We'll also explore the fine line between innovation and risk in the heat of war. The fake damage tactic was more than a prank, it was a calculated gamble, and it took real skill to pull off. As word spread through the squadron, more pilots wanted in on the trick. But painting convincing battle damage wasn't as simple as slapping on a few black marks. It required an artist's eye, a mechanic's knowledge, and a pilot's understanding of what the enemy was looking for. Lieutenant Sam Painter Harris became the squadron's unofficial camouflage expert. He spent hours studying real combat damage photographs of shot-up Mustangs, the twisted metal of crashed planes, and the oil-streaked panels of aircraft that had limped home. He learned to mimic the jagged edges of bullet holes, the brownish stains of leaking oil, and the scorched paint left by engine fires. He even experimented with fake cracks in the canopy and simulated shrapnel scars on the wings. The key was subtlety. Too much damage, and the plane would look like a wreck. No enemy pilot would waste ammunition on a plane that was already doomed. Too little, and the ruse wouldn't work. Harris and his fellow artists found the sweet spot, just enough damage to look vulnerable, but not so much that the plane seemed unworthy of pursuit. The squadron's mechanics got involved, too. They helped by adding a little real grime, leaving a panel slightly loose, or even bending a piece of sheet metal to make the illusion more convincing. The result was a fleet of Mustangs that looked battered, but still airborne, exactly the kind of target a German ace would want to finish off. But the deception didn't stop with paint. The pilots learned to fly their damaged planes differently. They would lag behind the formation, wobble in turns, and occasionally call out fake engine trouble over the radio. Sometimes, they'd even trail a little smoke using a hidden oil canister rigged to the exhaust. The goal was to look like a straggler, an easy kill, and to draw enemy fighters away from the main group. The first few missions were nerve-wracking. The pilots knew they were taking a risk. If the Germans caught on, or if their own side mistook them for real stragglers, the results could be deadly. But the tactic worked. Again and again, German fighters broke formation to attack the damaged Mustangs, only to be ambushed by a wingman waiting in the clouds, or by the crippled plane suddenly coming to life and fighting back. The squadron kept careful records. In the first month, they ambushed and shot down 40 enemy fighters, an astonishing number for a single unit. The tactic became a point of pride, a symbol of the squadron's ingenuity and teamwork. Pilots who had once dreaded every mission now looked forward to the chance to turn the tables on the enemy. But the success of the ruse also brought new challenges. The squadron had to keep refining their techniques, changing the patterns of damage, and rotating which planes played the role of the wounded bird. They also had to be careful not to overuse the tactic. If every plane looked damaged, the enemy would catch on. The element of surprise was everything. The squadron's leadership walked a fine line. Officially, the fake damage tactic was never written into the playbook. It was a field innovation, passed along by word of mouth and trusted only to the most disciplined pilots. The risk of friendly fire was real. Other American units might mistake the damaged Mustangs for actual stragglers and leave them behind. Communication and coordination were essential. The Germans, for their part, were slow to catch on. At first, they couldn't believe that so many American planes were flying with visible damage. Some pilots thought they were just lucky, others suspected a trick, but most were too eager for an easy kill to question their luck. The Luftwaffe's own doctrine emphasized aggression and the pursuit of vulnerable targets. The fake damage tactic turned that doctrine against them. The psychological impact was profound. German pilots began to hesitate before attacking stragglers, unsure if they were walking into a trap. Some units even changed their tactics, focusing on the main formation instead of chasing after crippled planes. The balance of power in the air began to shift. For the Marines and the Army Air Forces, the success of the fake damage tactic was a lesson in the power of innovation. It showed that sometimes the best way to win a fight is to make the enemy underestimate you, to turn their confidence into a weakness. It also showed that the people closest to the action, the pilots, the mechanics, the ground crews, are often the best source of new ideas. We'll follow the squadron as they adapt their tactics, face new challenges, and push the limits of deception and teamwork in the skies over Europe. As the squadron's fake damage tactic racked up more and more kills, word began to spread not just among the Americans, but among the Luftwaffe as well. German pilots, at first eager to pounce on what looked like crippled Mustangs, started to notice a pattern. The easy kills were fighting back with surprising ferocity. Some German aces began to suspect a trick, and whispers of painted wounds circulated in Luftwaffe-ready rooms. The squadron's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Mark Snoop Evans, was the first to pick up on the change. He noticed that German pilots were becoming more cautious, sometimes circling a damaged Mustang instead of diving straight in. Radio intercepts suggested that the enemy was warning each other to be wary of stragglers. The element of surprise, so crucial to the squadron's success, was starting to fade. But the Americans weren't about to give up their edge. Captain Jack Morgan called a meeting in the squadron tent. "They're catching on," he said, "so we have to get smarter." The pilots brainstormed new ways to keep the enemy guessing. Some suggested changing the patterns of fake damage, moving bullet holes from the wings to the tail, adding new scorch marks, or even simulating fuel leaks. Others proposed flying in different formations, using clouds and sun angles to mask their movements. The mechanics got creative too. They experimented with removable panels, quick-change paint jobs, and even fake smoke generators. The goal was to stay one step ahead of the enemy, to keep the ruse fresh and unpredictable. The squadron became a laboratory of innovation, with every pilot and crew member contributing ideas. The next missions put these new tactics to the test. The squadron rotated, which planes played the wounded bird, sometimes using 2 or 3 in a single formation. They coordinated with other units, using radio codes and visual signals to avoid friendly fire. The pilots practiced feigning engine trouble, wobbling in turns, and even trailing a little real smoke when needed. The results were mixed. Some German pilots still fell for the ruse, diving in for what they thought was an easy kill only to be ambushed by a waiting wingman. But others became more cautious, attacking from longer range or in larger groups. The air battles grew fiercer, with both sides adapting and counteradapting in a deadly game of cat and mouse. One mission in particular stood out. The squadron was escorting bombers over northern France when a group of FW-190s appeared on the horizon. Lieutenant Harris, flying a Mustang with fresh damage painted on the fuselage, lagged behind the formation, wobbling slightly as if struggling with engine trouble. 2 German fighters broke off from the main group and closed in for the kill. As they approached, Harris's wingman, Lieutenant Tex Morgan, dove out of the clouds and opened fire. The Germans, caught off guard, tried to break away, but it was too late. One FW-190 went down in flames, the other barely escaped. The rest of the German formation, seeing the trap, pulled back and regrouped. The Americans had won the engagement, but it was clear that the enemy was learning. The squadron's leadership knew that the fake damage tactic couldn't last forever. The Luftwaffe was adapting, and the risk of friendly fire or mistaken identity was always present. But the experience had taught the Americans something important: innovation is a moving target. What works today may not work tomorrow, and the key to survival is the ability to adapt faster than the enemy. The psychological impact of the tactic lingered. Even after the Germans became more cautious, the fear of ambush made them hesitate, second-guess, and sometimes miss real opportunities. The Marines and Army Air Forces realized that reputation and uncertainty could be as powerful as bullets and bombs. The fake damage tactic became a legend, a story told in mess halls and briefing rooms, a reminder that sometimes the best weapon is the one the enemy can't see coming. How the experience shaped the pilots and crews, forged bonds of trust, and left a legacy that lasted long after the paint had faded. The month that followed the squadron's first fake damage ambushes was one of the most intense and transformative periods in the unit's history. The pilots and ground crews, once just a collection of individuals thrown together by war, became a true brotherhood bound by shared risk, innovation, and the thrill of outsmarting the enemy. The painted wounds on their Mustangs were more than just camouflage. They were a badge of honor, a symbol of the squadron's daring and creativity. Every mission was now a test of nerves and teamwork. The pilots, who played the wounded bird role, had to trust their wingmen completely. They flew at the edge of the formation, lagging just enough to look vulnerable, but not so much as to be left behind. Their wingmen, hidden in the sun or clouds, watched for the first sign of enemy movement, ready to pounce the moment a German fighter took the bait. The ground crews, too, became part of the act. They worked late into the night, repainting bullet holes, oil streaks, and scorch marks after every mission. They swapped stories and tips, perfecting the art of deception. Some even started adding their own touches: fake rivet lines, simulated cracks, and creative battle scars that made each plane unique. The mechanics took pride in their work, knowing that their efforts were saving lives and winning battles. The squadron's success bred a new kind of confidence. Pilots who had once dreaded every mission now looked forward to the challenge. The laughter that greeted each new damaged Mustang was genuine, but it was also a release of tension, a way to cope with the ever-present danger. The squadron's mess tent became a place of camaraderie, where pilots and crew could relax, share a drink, and celebrate their victories. But the pressure was always there. Every mission carried the risk of failure, of being caught by the enemy, or of being mistaken for a real straggler by friendly forces. The squadron's leadership worked hard to maintain discipline and communication. Briefings were detailed and thorough, with every pilot and crew member knowing their role and the plan for the day. The intelligence officer, Lieutenant Evans, kept a close eye on enemy radio traffic and adjusted tactics as needed. The squadron's reputation began to spread. Other units heard about the fake damage tactic and started to experiment with their own versions. Some tried painting their planes, others used smoke generators or even staged minor mechanical failures to lure the enemy in. The tactic became a point of pride for the squadron, but also a source of rivalry. Who could pull off the most convincing ruse? Who could score the most kills with the least risk? The month's tally was impressive: 40 enemy fighters ambushed and shot down, with minimal losses to the squadron. The pilots credited their success to teamwork, discipline, and the willingness to try something new. The ground crews took equal pride, knowing that their paint and ingenuity had played a crucial role. But the experience also left its mark. The pilots who played the wounded bird role often felt a unique kind of stress. They were the bait, the ones who had to look weak and vulnerable, knowing that the enemy was hunting them. The trust between pilot and wingman became absolute. Each relied on the other for survival, and the bond that formed was unbreakable. One pilot, Lieutenant Harris, later described the feeling. You're out there, flying slow, wobbling a little, pretending your engine's about to quit. You know the Germans are watching, waiting for you to make a mistake. Your wingman is up there somewhere, hidden, and you have to trust that he's got your back. When the enemy finally takes the bait and dives in, it's like a switch flips. Suddenly you're not the prey, you're the trap. And when it works, when you see that fighter go down, it's the best feeling in the world. The squadron's leadership recognized the toll the tactic was taking. They rotated pilots through the wounded bird role, made sure everyone got time off, and encouraged open communication. The squadron psychologist, a young lieutenant named Dr. Markson, held regular debriefings, helping pilots process the stress and adrenaline of combat. He encouraged them to talk about their fears, their doubts, and their pride in what they were accomplishing. The fake damage tactic also changed the way the squadron thought about innovation. The pilots and crews realized that the best ideas often came from the ground up, from the people who were closest to the action. The squadron commander, Colonel Davis, made it clear that he valued creativity and initiative. If you see a better way to do something, speak up, he told his men. We're fighting a smart enemy. We have to be smarter. The squadron's success became a source of inspiration for other units. Stories of their ambushes spread through the Air Force, and soon other squadrons were asking for advice, sharing tips, and even sending mechanics to learn the art of painting fake damage. The tactic became part of the larger story of American innovation in World War II, a story of improvisation, adaptation, and the willingness to take risks. But the squadron never lost sight of the cost. Every victory came with a price. Some missions ended in tragedy, with pilots lost or captured. The laughter and camaraderie in the mess tent were always tinged with the knowledge that not everyone would make it home. The fake damage tactic was a tool, not a guarantee. The war was still deadly, and the enemy was still dangerous. As the month drew to a close, the squadron's tally stood at 40 enemy fighters ambushed and destroyed. The pilots and crew celebrated their success, but they also knew that the enemy was adapting. The Luftwaffe was becoming more cautious, more disciplined, and more determined to avoid the traps. The squadron's leadership began to plan for the next phase: new tactics, new innovations, and new ways to stay one step ahead. As the squadron's month of painted deception drew to a close, the impact of their innovation was being felt far beyond their own airfield. The fake damage tactic had started as a desperate gamble, but it had become a case study in how psychological warfare and creative thinking could change the course of battle. The squadron's success: 40 enemy fighters ambushed and destroyed in just 1 month wasn't just a fluke. It was proof that the mind could be as powerful a weapon as the machine gun. The squadron's leadership, now fully convinced of the tactic's value, began to document their methods. They wrote after-action reports, shared paint formulas, and even took photographs of the best battle damage paint jobs to send to other units. The intelligence officer, Lieutenant Evans, compiled a dossier of enemy radio intercepts and pilot debriefings, showing how the Germans' initial overconfidence had turned to suspicion and caution. The squadron's story was quietly passed up the chain of command, and soon other groups were experimenting with their own versions of the ruse. But the real legacy of the fake damage tactic was in the way it changed the squadron's approach to combat. The pilots and crews had learned that innovation wasn't just about new technology, it was about new ways of thinking. They became more willing to question orders, to try unorthodox solutions, and to trust their own instincts. The squadron's culture shifted from one of strict adherence to doctrine to one of creative problem-solving. This new mindset paid dividends in other areas. When the Luftwaffe began to adapt, the squadron responded with new tricks, feigned radio chatter, staged emergency landings, and even coordinated bait and switch maneuvers with neighboring units. The pilots became masters of misdirection, using clouds, sun angles, and formation changes to keep the enemy guessing. The ground crews, too, continued to refine their craft, developing faster ways to repaint damage and even experimenting with temporary mud splatter effects to simulate recent hits. The psychological impact on the enemy was profound. German pilots, once eager to chase stragglers, now hesitated. Some Luftwaffe units issued orders to avoid attacking damaged Mustangs unless they were certain the target was truly crippled. The fear of ambush became a constant concern, eroding the aggressiveness that had once been the hallmark of German fighter tactics. The squadron's own morale soared. The pilots took pride in their reputation as innovators and tricksters. The ground crews, often overlooked in the glory of air combat, became heroes in their own right. The sense of shared purpose and mutual respect grew stronger with every successful mission. The squadron's mess tent was filled with laughter, stories, and a sense of camaraderie that would last long after the war. But the squadron's success also raised important questions about the nature of war. Was it ethical to use deception in this way? Did the tactic put pilots at greater risk of being mistaken for real stragglers by their own side? The leadership debated these issues, but ultimately decided that the benefits outweighed the risks. The tactics saved lives, disrupted the enemy, and gave the squadron a crucial edge in a deadly game. The fake damage tactic also had a ripple effect on the broader air war. Other units began to adopt similar methods, and the idea of using psychological warfare in the skies became more accepted. The U.S. Army Air Forces and the Navy both studied the squadron's reports, looking for ways to incorporate deception into their own operations. The lessons learned would influence not just World War II, but future conflicts as well. The squadron's story became a legend, told and retold in training classes, reunions, and history books. The pilots and crews who had lived through that month of deception carried the lessons with them for the rest of their lives. They knew that victory wasn't just about firepower or numbers, it was about the ability to think, to adapt, and to outsmart the enemy. As the war moved on and the squadron faced new challenges, the spirit of innovation remained. The fake damage tactic was just one example of how creativity and teamwork could turn the tide of battle. The squadron's legacy was not just in the number of enemy planes shot down, but in the culture of adaptability and resilience they left behind. The war ended, but the story of the fake damage squadron lived on. In the years that followed, their month of painted deception became more than just a footnote in the history of World War II. It became a parable for every pilot, mechanic, and commander who ever faced an enemy that seemed stronger, faster, or more numerous. The squadron's legacy was felt first in the way air combat was taught and understood. In post-war training schools, instructors told the story of the painted wounds as a lesson in psychological warfare. New generations of pilots learned that the mind could be as powerful a weapon as the machine gun. They studied how the squadron had used the enemy's own instincts against them, turning overconfidence into a fatal weakness. The lesson was clear: never underestimate the value of surprise, and never be afraid to try something new. The U.S. Air Force and Navy both took note. In Korea, Vietnam, and even in the Cold War, deception became a standard part of the playbook. Pilots learned to use feints, false radio calls, and even visual tricks to lure the enemy into traps. The fake damage tactic was adapted for new aircraft, new weapons, and new enemies. The spirit of innovation that had defined the squadron became part of the DNA of American air power, but the legacy went beyond tactics. The story of the squadron's month of deception became a symbol of what makes a great fighting force: not just courage and skill, but creativity, teamwork, and the willingness to break the mold. The pilots and ground crews, who had risked everything for a chance to outsmart the enemy, became heroes in their own right. Their story was told in books, documentaries, and at reunions where old friends remembered the thrill of turning the tables on the Luftwaffe. For the men who lived it, the experience was unforgettable. Many went on to become leaders, instructors, or innovators in their own fields. They carried with them the lesson that sometimes the best ideas come from the ground up, from the people who are closest to the action, who see the problems firsthand, and who aren't afraid to try something different. The fake damage tactic also left a mark on the enemy. Post-war interviews with German pilots revealed a grudging respect for the Americans' ingenuity. Some admitted that the fear of ambush changed the way they fought, making them more cautious and less aggressive. The psychological impact of the tactic lingered long after the last dogfight was over. But perhaps the most important legacy of the squadron's innovation is the reminder that war is not just about machines or firepower, it is about people. It's about the ability to adapt, to learn, and to find new ways to win when the old ways no longer work. The fake damage squadron proved that even in the darkest moments, a little creativity and a lot of teamwork can make all the difference. As you finish this documentary, think about what the story of the fake damage squadron means for us today. Is it a lesson in the power of innovation? A reminder that the enemy is always watching for weakness? Or simply a story of how ordinary people, facing extraordinary challenges, can change the course of history? Whatever it is, let it inspire you to face your own battles with the same spirit of determination and hope. If you've enjoyed this journey through the story of the squadron that turned deception into victory, please like, comment, and subscribe for more untold World War II stories and deep dives into the technology and people that shaped history. What do you think is the most important lesson from the fake damage tactic? Share your thoughts below. We love hearing your take. Thank you for joining us on this flight through history. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep remembering the real stories behind the legends.